Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 20th of September and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will have a look at today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will look at the stories behind today's news headlines together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 3,077,888 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,541,933 have been confirmed negative, and 535,955 have tested positive. There are 2,917 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with the symptoms will be tested. There are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,378. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,088 were in hospital last night, 97 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,157,613 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,810,775 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 135,252 patients who tested positive from COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 49 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. Now this evening we are lucky enough to be joined by Professor John Robertson. Professor Robertson was a professor in media politics and worked in higher education for more than 30 years. His background is as a sociologist and educational technologist, and his teaching experience covers in particular learning theories, technology-based education, and critical analysis of socio-economic change. You will no doubt have seen or read his analysis of news and media in Scotland, particularly in the run-up to the elections and the last independence referendum, and the blog that he still maintains. Professor Robertson, thank you for joining us on Scotland at 7 this evening. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me on. I have to say, after 6 years of retirement, hearing my CV like that, I sound more impressive than I feel.
Not at all. We're very lucky to have you on this evening, and we're really looking forward to it. Our first story this evening is that Number 10 has brushed off the idea that there could be a winter of discontent with energy and food shortages over Christmas, saying the UK is highly resilient. With the government locked in talks with energy suppliers about the rising cost of gas and many firms struggling to stay afloat, Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, said there was no question of the lights going out. Mr. Kwarteng insisted the energy price cap to protect consumers from sharp rises in bills will remain in place. However, households are already facing a rise of 12 to 13% in the cap, an average of £139 this October, and there is no guarantee that it will not rise further next year in response to the global gas price shock. The high price of gas has forced some CO2 producers to shut down, leading the meat industry to warn that there could be shortages in the coming months, because the gas is needed for humane slaughter, stunning, packaging and refrigeration. Even production of iron brew and other soft drinks could be affected by the CO2 shortage. The boss of the Iceland supermarket chain has warned that UK food supplies will be under threat long before Christmas and could start affecting stocks within days if carbon dioxide shortages continue. While concerns have been raised about how CO2 shortages might harm Christmas food supplies as grocers start stocking up for the holidays, Iceland's managing director Richard Walker said the problem, which has been compounded by the shortage of HGV drivers, could affect UK supermarket shelves much sooner. The SNP has called for the Chancellor to introduce an emergency package of measures to boost household incomes, including an energy payment for lower income families, warning the UK is facing a Tory-made cost of living crisis. With energy bills soaring, Stephen Flynn MP said Boris Johnson has broken his pledge to make energy bills cheaper after Brexit, and is instead hammering low and middle income families with a toxic concoction of UK government cuts and tax hikes. The SNP's Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy spokesperson said the need to boost incomes and tackle the Tory cost of living crisis would be the central issue at the coming UK budget, and called for an emergency package of measures, including reversing the £1,040 cut to universal credit, extending the uplift to legacy benefits, introducing a real living wage, and introducing an energy payment for lower income families this year. So, John, first of all, as I mentioned at the beginning, Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, has insisted that there is no question of the lights going out. So it strikes me that if the lights going out is at the top of it, is at the forefront of his mind, does that mean that that's more likely that's what's going to happen?
I think that seems a likely conclusion to draw, doesn't it? When a Conservative leader suggests that everything is safe, I think you start to sort of worry there. I'm old enough to remember the lights going out in the 70s, and I'm sure politicians back then, Labour and Conservative, promised they wouldn't go out. I'm just astonished. I'm just astonished that the consequences of Brexit are already so obviously severe that there isn't an equivalent to the Brexit Party called, I don't know, Rejoin It or something, started up and already ahead in the opinion polls. If some half-decent politician were to launch a party called Rejoin It, I'd imagine support would go through the roof. It's astonishing.
It's a good point that you make, John. Thinking of Brexit for a moment, in the Sun tabloid on the 30th of May 2016, Johnson said, and I quote, "Fuel bills will be lower for everyone," and his, how can I put this, sidekick, Gisela Stewart, said, quote, "Wages will be higher and fuel bills will be lower." Personally speaking, I'm astonished by this. Who would think that Tory and Labour politicians would either misrepresent or get things completely and utterly wrong?
Yeah. In some ways, the reaction of the Labour Party is the more predictable, I suppose. Such as their lack of intelligence and their lack of courage. They haven't. There is no one within that party with the guts and with the kind of personality to lead a reaction that would be hugely popular with the people. The idea that we'll be running out of gas is of course of particular resonance for those of us living in Scotland. I mean, Scotland produces 25% of the UK's gas supply. Most of the rest comes from Norway and Russia. We only use about a third of that. If we were an independent country, we could be exporting a considerable amount of gas to our neighbours. But no doubt we'll be paying the same prices. I was a People's Energy customer until recently. I guess I'm now a British Gas customer until I can find something better.
Yes, of course, and it's a good point that you make in terms of Scottish politics. As you say, we're a net exporter of oil and gas, and if gas, thinking from an independence argument perspective, if the price of gas goes up, does that begin to pull away some of the arguments against independence that with regard to the price of oil and gas?
You would hope so, but I mean, of course, we've had several pieces of evidence to suggest that independence makes tremendous economic sense. We've had quite a few in the last few years, but the opinion polls are stubbornly where they were, right in the middle, and it makes me wonder just what it takes for some of the population to give up on the union. It seems like they need to be slapped about the face with with something wet to wake them up.
Well, that's very true, and one wonders if we're going to see if the winter of discontent, which Tory ministers deny is going to be upon us. Do you think a winter of discontent may be the pivot or the fork in the road that some voters in Scotland need?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've used a fork in the road there, a pivot. I mean, it's a kind of tipping point, isn't it? It does look as if we're stuck at 50-50 in the opinion polls. But that doesn't mean it won't change. And it may be that it takes a real tough lesson from a hard winter, and that might just push us over the edge, and suddenly we're into 60 plus percent for independence. I can only hope.
Absolutely. Stepping back from discussing independence for a moment, does the what I'll characterise as the rolling debacle of the implementation of Brexit that we're seeing both in political terms and in more practical terms with regard to the supply chain for food and the availability of gas to make CO2, does this rolling debacle demonstrate or remind us that some, if not many, of our politicians simply have no grasp of how supply chains and indeed our interconnected, just-in-time modern world actually works?
Yes, it does seem remarkably naive. I suppose when you look at the kind of background that the Tory leadership has, in marketing and classics, it's maybe not surprising that they don't have much of a grasp of the modern world, or the global world. So we certainly could do with some intelligent politicians, couldn't we?
And if we are indeed facing a winter of discontent and the crises that will be associated with that, then yes, perhaps some more real world experience and maybe some better experience of managing the real world might be required. One critical question also crossed my mind in connection with this story, and John, are you a fan of Iron Brew?
Eh, Me, sort of. I'm more a Guinness man.
Well, my follow-up question applies equally as to whether do you think you're going to have to be seeking out illicit under-the-counter supplies of either Iron Brew or Guinness?
Well, yeah, I I hope not. I hope not. I mean, I have good connections with local suppliers, so I'd be quite disappointed if they don't keep some for me. I've been a good customer.
Well, we all hope so. Absolutely right. And thinking, you mentioned your as consumer and the forced changes in supplier that the current regime for the gas markets in the UK imposes. There was a definite suggestion this morning that the government is going to have to relook or re-examine the regime that they have currently implemented, and in particular, as you say, the regime where if a gas supplier fails, its customers are then subsumed by a larger gas supplier who then gets larger and gets a larger share of the UK pie, therefore thereby reducing competition in the marketplace and probably reducing customer service too. Do you think, speaking from your own perspective as a consumer, do you think that the UK domestic gas supply market is going to have to be restructured as a result of this?
Well, it does look as if the major suppliers are now back in an almost monopoly position, and the consumer is now really in quite a weak position. I can't imagine there's much empathy in the Conservative cabinet for any kind of restructuring. I mean, it doesn't cause them any harm. I think we're all facing an increase in costs. The only possible positive note here is, as Scotland in particular surges towards 100% electricity supply from renewables, and we maybe look at a situation where the Scottish government finds a way to actually help people make that switch over to electric, that we can put that behind us if we're quick.
That's a good point, John. And of course, we were being reminded that I think there was a previous political promise from the Scottish government to begin to establish or re-establish a national energy company. Proposals which I don't think have gone very far. Do you think this might be the trigger to dust off that policy and bring it back to the front?
It would make tremendous sense. It was disappointing that company didn't come off. I don't know enough of the inside details as to why it didn't happen. I can't imagine it was for lack of belief in the idea that it didn't happen. I guess there must have been barriers, and there are other steps within the plan for government which will compensate to some extent funds to make houses easier to heat, which of course predate the gas announcement.
Yes, of course. Actually, we'll stick with energy markets for our second story, if that's okay. And SSEN Transmission has this week published some further analysis exploring the impact of the current transition charging regime on meeting the UK's legally binding net zero emissions target, this time focusing specifically on impact for offshore wind developers. With Scotland boasting the greatest wind resources to meet the UK's net zero targets, and future ScotWind leasing sites expected to deliver up to 10 gigawatts of the UK's 40 gigawatt requirement by 2030 offshore wind target, the findings suggest that the current TNUOS scheme is creating a huge barrier for further low-carbon investment, despite great support for further deployment through UK and Scottish Government policy. Evidence suggests that the current regime results in Scottish generators paying a higher cost for use of the transmission network compared to other areas in GB, making projects less competitive in CFD auctions and creating risk to future offshore wind deployment. Responding to the SSE in Analysis paper, the SNP's spokesperson Stephen Flynn MP pointed out that report after report confirms that the current system of transmission charging is penalising Scotland, adding that while Scottish renewables projects are paying huge sums to access the grid, equivalent projects in England are paid to connect to the same national grid. Mr Flynn called this renewables rubbery. The Aberdeen South MP said Scotland has the potential to lead Europe in renewable energy, but we are being held back by a UK government with no interest in our net zero future, which has left us with the highest transmission charges in Europe. So, John, the long and the short of it, or rather the near and the far of it, is that the further you are away from London and the British Isles, the higher the charges you have to pay for connecting to the national grid in order to supply into the national grid. Do you think, does this give the lie to Johnson and indeed the Cameron and May governments too? Does it give the lie to their claim to have any interest whatsoever in the climate crisis, maybe unless they or their mates can turn a quick buck?
It's an incredibly sharp an example of how disadvantageous the union is for Scotland. Much of the UK is dependent on imported energy. It's imported from all over. The gas from Russia and from Norway, electricity from other places. And although Scotland is in a position to actually provide within the United Kingdom much of the energy, and has been doing for several years, we've been transferring huge amounts of electricity. Not only do we subsidise the situation in the rest of the UK, we're penalised for doing so. It's an incredible example of just how disappointing the relationship is, and we'd be well out of it.
Absolutely. Do you think the impending COP26 and the international and transnational discussions that are going to surround that, do you think that the Scottish Government and other campaigners might bring this particular curious arrangement to more international attention and attempt to apply a bit more pressure to the UK government?
Well, hopefully, but I mean, as far as I can see, there is an attempt to keep the Scottish Government out of this. And I think that the reasoning is fairly obvious, that if the Scottish Government were to be represented there, able to talk about Scotland's position, the third highest producer of renewables-based electricity in Europe, and with huge tree planting. I mean, about 80% of the new trees in the UK planted here. If the people attending that conference were able to see what Scotland is doing, it's going to make the rest of the UK and the Johnson regime look very, 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 very poor indeed.
That's a good point. I can see a graphic or a helicopter ride to examine some of that tree planting coming along quite quickly. But otherwise, John, if huge corporate interests like SSE are publishing critical research like this, then, well, do you think maybe the UK government might change its mind, or are the oil majors more important to them than SSE?
Well, I mean, if there's one thing you can say about the Conservatives is that they might not be properly educated in the way we would need in a modern society, but they are very pragmatic, and they're very strong on self-surviving instinct. So, I mean, I think it is possible they will make a leap, and they won't hesitate. They've dumped other interests in the past, and they'll dump the oil and gas interests at that point at which they think it's in their interest to suddenly become the champions of renewables. So wouldn't be surprising.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. We'll move to our next story now, and that is that pressure is mounting on Boris Johnson to perform an 11th hour U turn on devastating plans to cut universal credit payments, as new analysis shows almost 500,000 Scots will see their income slashed by £1,040 a year. As MPs vote on a cross party amendment today, new analysis from the House of Commons Library using the latest DWP data has revealed that 477,996 people in Scotland could be hit if the UK government goes ahead with the cuts, at a total cost to Scottish families of around £430 million a year. In a breakdown of Scottish constituencies, the analysis shows those that would be hardest hit by these Tory cuts include Glasgow Central, with 13,206 people on universal credit. And that's almost 16% of the population aged 16 to 65. Glasgow South West with 11,444 people, that's almost 20%. Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath with 11,372, and that's more than 18% of the population between 16 and 65. Kilmarnock and Loudon with 10,833, that's 17.4% of the working age population, and Dundee West with 10,461 people, that's 16.8% of the working age population. The SNP have said they will be voting in favour of the amendment to stop the universal credit cuts in today's Commons vote. The SNP Work and Pension spokesperson David Linden MP has called for the £20 a week uplift to be made permanent and extended to legacy benefits. Now, John, first of all, we seem to be marking time on this issue now in a way. We've been covering it more or less daily for weeks on Broadcasting Scotland. And now I appreciate that Johnson won't do anything until there's a full-blown crisis. That seems to be his way of handling difficult questions. And I can understand that that the opposition, either in the case of British Labour, or maybe still desperate to win over working class Tories, will say nothing. Another opposition will perhaps wait until there's a real crisis in order that they can say, "We told you so." So in all of that politicking, where do you think that leaves the actual people affected by one of the largest social security cuts in our history?
I think it's a disastrous situation, and there'll be a great deal of suffering as a result of it. I mean, people will not only suffer. I mean, some will die as a result of that harshness. It's no surprise that the Conservative government has that inbuilt cruelty and lack of regard for human beings. But in addition to that, it's not just cruel; it's stupid. I don't have a degree in economics. I've read a bit about economics, but I know one thing. If you let the less well off have a slightly better income, they spend it. They spend every penny of it. It is then converted into VAT, and the Treasury gets most of it back. It doesn't cost much to have a more equal society. It's just this is based on a complete misunderstanding, and somebody with a degree in classics, of course, won't understand that basic point.
No, absolutely, John. We were discussing last week how it could possibly be the case that you could punish people out of poverty, and we can't find an answer to that question. But from a Scottish perspective, as I mentioned, according to the House of Commons Library, the total cost to Scottish families of this policy is thought to be likely to be around £430 million a year. Do you think that the instinct at Holyrood will be to see if £430 million a year can be found, and therefore another Tory benefit cut will be mitigated by the Scottish budget?
Well, I mean, I'm not an insider on this. I don't really know what the Scottish government feels it can do. I mean, I can understand why they might feel they want to mitigate this. I mean, they have already mitigated a great deal. You can see from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's research, you can see that child poverty in particular is significantly lower in Scotland. It's partly to do with more affordable housing. I feel absolutely certain that the cabinet in Scotland will be motivated, but it's a lot of money, and of course, and if you do it, of course, you're just applying elastoplast onto a system that's inherently cruel and as I said earlier, stupid.
Yes, there's the problem of as you say, a sticking plaster approach, and also, I suppose, in a sense, the risk of a perception that you're in some way, rewarding or mitigating dogmatic, cruel, as you say, social security cuts, which might, in some twisted circumstances, there might be a risk that that would encourage more of the same, thinking that
Mm.
every time there's a problem that the Scottish government will step in. But thinking about politics more generally, and we've spoken already this evening about Labour politicians and Tory politicians. What do you think opposition politicians should be doing in response to this social security cut? And depending on what that is, why are they not already doing it?
Well, I mean, the Labour Party and Labour Party, the UK Labour Party, um, I don't know if I'm allowed to say the word cojones, but clearly I'll say it,
You are.
lacks the cojones to actually fight the Conservatives on economic theory. Because, as I think you hinted earlier, they think the only way they can win is to somehow draw back the left wing of the Conservative vote, those kind of caring Conservatives, those working class Conservatives. They think that's the only way. I'm not convinced. I think Jeremy Corbyn came pretty close, and I think if he'd had a better run at it and slightly more fair media coverage, I think we might have a genuinely left of centre Labour Party in the UK, and that to me would be the only solution.
It's a fair point that you make. I was reflecting last night as the news regarding the potential financial support to gas companies was starting to be discussed in the news, and I was reflecting on the what appears to be the risk or the chance that we'll have a Conservative government that's renationalising gas companies, which is could only be described as a Corbyn policy, but there seems to be a risk that it's about to be implemented by the Conservatives,
Mm.
which shows just how far things have gone. But we'll move on to the next story now, and that is that the Chancellor has been warned not to pull the rug out from under the economy by cutting support for jobs and businesses abruptly and prematurely. As new analysis shows, the hospitality and services industry could be hardest hit when the UK government ends furlough support at the end of September. Analysis from the House of Commons Library using the latest HMRC data has revealed that 259,100 jobs in accommodation and food services remain furloughed at the latest count, representing 15% of the eligible jobs in the industry. In total, 1,563,600 jobs across the UK remain furloughed at the last count. That includes 224,500 jobs in retail, 161,500 in administration and support services, 155,900 in manufacturing, 120,400 in transportation, 114,200 in construction, and 73,900 in the arts and entertainment. With 10 days to go until the UK government ends the furlough scheme at the same time as raising taxes and cutting universal credit payments by £1,040 a year, Stephen Flynn MP warned the government is creating a perfect storm that could result in rising unemployment, poverty, and inequality. So, John, from my own recent experience, most restaurant and dining settings are still operating with very restricted table numbers and have no plans to change that. As a result, they do not have sufficient revenue to cover full-time working, and so their workforces have been reduced. And yet, at the same time, I can also see that many are also operating limited opening hours because they cannot get skilled kitchen staff such as chefs. They're just not available. So that suggests to me that the problem in the workforce and the labour market is a whole lot worse and is about to deteriorate. So thinking of this apparent perfect storm that Stephen Flynn mentioned, what's your current view on the weather forecast regarding this current storm?
Well, I think I sense you could use the word tsunami was in the media quite a lot in the past. Perfect storm's being used. I think the economy is in deep trouble, and hospitality is one of the weaker areas in that. I think the problem has been, to my mind, that many of those who worked in hospitality have either gone home to Europe or they've found other jobs in the UK, and they've found jobs which pay better, are more steady, and with better hours, and they're not coming back. I think I'm not suggesting this is true of all hospitality businesses by any means, but many hospitality businesses maybe didn't treat their workers as well as they should, and maybe if they had provided them with a better income, more stability, more guarantees, and better hours, then maybe they get them back quicker.
That's a good point, John. I was seeing anecdotal suggestions yesterday of lorry drivers being offered £54 an hour for driving, which
Mm.
on their standard roster amounts to about £100,000 a year, which
Yes,
suggests that yes, there's a significant change in the labour market about to appear, and also I need
this
to
is
go and
a
get an HGV license.
this is a plague effect. I remember reading about the Black Death, back in the 14th century. One of the all disasters have positive outcomes for some people, and at the end of the Black Death, the population of Europe was much reduced, and that enabled farm labourers to suddenly demand better conditions and better wages, and was the beginning, I suppose, of a better kind of existence for working class people. So, this, in a smaller way, perhaps this current plague will benefit some occupations, and HGV lorry drivers look like becoming the new elite.
Absolutely, the law of unintended consequences. I
Mm.
completely agree. We'll move on to our next story now, and that is that the Scottish Government has announced plans to extend the current Emergency Measures Agreements (EMAs) for both the ScotRail and Caledonian Sleeper franchises. The EMAs, which were put in place in March 2021, will now be in place until December 2021. These agreements will carry on to help to secure the sustainability of Scotland's rail services through this transitional period. Train operators will continue to receive payments to cover operating costs as necessary because of reduced revenues, and with a small incentive payment linked strictly to good performance. Transport Minister Graham Day said, "As we continue through a period of economic recovery from the pandemic, we have extended the emergency measures agreements in order to minimise disruption to passengers and rail employees and to allow passenger services to continue to operate during this period." Now, John, we were talking earlier about the plague effect, the law of unintended consequences, and I think the rail industry, in the run-up to to privatisation, and then subsequent to privatisation and radical reorganisation on a regular basis, probably demonstrates a number of the unintended consequences that follow from ill thought out or dogmatic political decisions. But with ScotRail expected to return to public hands soon at the expiry of the current Abellio contract, do you think, will that mean that taxpayers will need to shell out less because they're already at the moment they're paying dividends to the Dutch government who control Abellio, and so will money be better spent in the rail sector in Scotland?
Well, you would hope that would be the case. It seems like the obvious consequence of that change. I think the problem here is, and you refer to the unintended consequences here, or the plague effect, and it's clearly true that public transport is now in deep trouble, and it won't be over just because we suddenly open up the economy. People are scared. Anyone who has a car, who can access a car, will travel by car to work or for any other purpose rather than squeeze into a bus or a train. And it'll take a long time to turn that around. I'm not sure, I'm not sure we can easily turn it around. One of the great hopes, of course, would be that within urban areas, that people will be pushed onto bicycles as well as returning to their cars.
That's a good point, John. And you, as you say, the perhaps understandable way in which people are varying their commuting and their travelling practices by avoiding public transport because they are concerned. How do you think that's going to play in the context of the less than 50 days now until COP26 in Glasgow?
Well, that's an obvious consequence, isn't it? It's definitely put a spoke in the wheels. If I can stick with these kind of cycling metaphors, I think that is a real problem for the whole business of trying to improve our carbon production here. I think I don't know, but clearly people are not going to be forced back into public transport. They're just not going to do it. They'll find other ways.
Thanks, John. And one other question crosses my mind: does thinking more generally, does this extension of emergency measures supporting rail services in Scotland suggest that similar support may be required in other sectors or industries through the rest of this year?
Well, it would make a lot of sense that that were the case. It's clearly this government clearly has in mind to cut now and to stop with all of this support. I mean, their whole ideology is not based on supporting systems. It's on this idea that systems will run themselves. It's the whole principle of their kind of laissez-faire capitalism that they still adhere to. They will compromise at times when they suggest the PR would be too bad, and they will at times intervene. But I think overall they will try and make sure that we return to a kind of Victorian world of the survival of the fittest.
Yes, yes, or the survival of those born with the largest silver spoon, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We'll move, John, to our next story, and that's international news that a student armed with a hunting rifle opened fire at a university in the Russian city of Perm on Monday, killing at least 6 people and wounding many others, investigators have said. Video shown on news websites showed panicked students leaping from first-floor windows to escape Perm State University, around 1,300 kilometers east of Moscow, landing heavily on the ground before running to safety. The gunman was wounded after resisting arrest and was being treated in hospital, the Investigative Committee Law Enforcement Agency said in a statement. The Investigative Committee had initially said that 8 people had been killed, however that number has now been revised down to 6. The gunman was identified as a student at the university who had obtained the hunting rifle in May. Russia has relatively strict restrictions on civilian firearm ownership, but some categories of guns are available for purchase for hunting, self-defense, or sport to those who meet the specific requirements. Now, John, stepping back for a moment, during the evacuation of the airport at Kabul, I stay very close to an airport here, and I was briefly stopping and thinking of what the circumstances would have looked like here if the same crisis had been playing out at the airport that I live closest to. You spent 30 years, more than 30 years, in education and in university settings. What's your reaction personally to news of a mass shooting in any educational institution, be it a university or a high school?
Well, there has only been one in Scotland, of course, at all, and that was
Mhm.
in Dunblane. I'm not aware of any major incidents. It strikes me that if you try and take a global perspective on this, and it's not an easy thing to do, but there is fairly high access to weapons in Russia because of the amount of hunting that goes on. The same is true in Finland, and there is a very high level of access to automatic weapons in Switzerland, but they don't have a lot of shootings, far fewer than they have in the United States. Although the number in Russia maybe is increasing. I don't have the statistics. I've got a feeling that people talk about the access to the weapons as if that were somehow the main factor. I think it's the nature of society you have, and if I don't know if any of you or if you or your readers or your viewers, I should say, have read the Spirit Level books, but it's fairly clear that violent crime is more common in unequal societies, brutal societies, where people feel disadvantaged and they feel their lives have no hope, and they feel that other people have all the advantages and haven't earned them. Now, Britain is moving that way, becoming more unequal. It seems to me that these shootings, you would think statistically should be more common in Finland. They have far more guns. Should be common in Switzerland, but those societies are much more equal. The gap between the rich and the poor is much narrower. People feel better about their lives in those countries, and I think that's the big factor.
Well, that's helpful, John, because you've preempted my question, which was going to be: do you think that there are parallels which can be drawn between shootings at high schools and universities in the US and these recent shootings in the same settings in Russia?
Well, I mean, this is me talking off the top of my head just now, which as
Mhm.
a former researcher, I shouldn't be doing maybe. But as I suggested there, I mean, Russia has moved from Russia had many problems. The Soviet Union had many problems, but it was a more egalitarian society than it is now. I mean, it's now become an extreme form of capitalism there with extreme inequalities. And so lots of people are really disadvantaged and very unhappy. And I think feel offended by the way they're treated by the system there. The same is true in the US. Horribly unequal society. And as I suggested already, plenty guns in Finland, plenty guns in Switzerland, hardly any shootings. I think there must be something in that.
I think you're right, John. And I was also going to ask, Uh, gun ownership was supposed to be further restricted in Russia after a high school shooting in Kazan in 2018. However, the new laws there have not yet been brought into force. Uh,
I
uh,
see.
and in contrast, after a terrorist outrage in New Zealand 18 months ago, the gun control legislation was introduced, and again in a society that had relatively high levels of gun ownership for sporting and farming reasons. The gun control laws were radically overhauled, and the weapons that were used in that atrocity were banned pretty much overnight. So,
Yeah.
why do you think some legislators in some countries are so slow in banning lethal weapons and so quick to react in others?
Well, I think again, it's the kind of people who are in power. And the kind of people who are in power in Switzerland, I think, to my mind, sorry, in New Zealand, are comparable to the kind of people in power in Switzerland and Finland. And I would say to some extent the Scottish government as well. I mean, the SNP and before the SNP, you remember after the Dunblane shooting, legislation came in very quickly to deal with handguns. And we've had nothing since then. So I think it's down to the kind of, you either end up with these selfish, borderline psychopaths running a country, as we have, and as the Americans have, and then you get the kind of society that they would actually that they tolerate.
Yes, absolutely. And I must admit, a shiver just ran up my spine as I remember that Nigel Farage was campaigning for the for the overturning of the ban on handguns in the UK, which
Yeah.
followed the Dunblane massacre. But we'll move on to our next story now, and we'll stay in Russia because Russian authorities have been accused of mass fraud after the ruling United Russia Party, which supports President Vladimir Putin, won a bigger than expected parliamentary majority. With over 99% of ballots counted, the Central Election Commission said that United Russia had won nearly 50% of the vote, with its nearest rival, the Communist Party, taking just under 19%. The scale of the victory means United Russia will have more than two-thirds of the deputies in the 450-seat State Duma lower house of parliament. This will enable it to continue to push through laws without having to rely on other parties. United Russia, a party that Putin helped found, had always been expected to win. Its most vociferous critics, allies of the jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny, were prevented from taking part after a court branded them extremists in June. Now, this evening, we've seen camera footage on the Twitter feed of Bill Browder, the lawyer and anti-corruption campaigner, which appears to show a St. Petersburg police officer standing by as a masked man pushes into an election, into a polling station, pushes an election observer aside and steals ballot papers. There have been other videos emerging over the weekend, especially from CCTV cameras inside polling stations. So, John, thinking of our own recent experiences of governing parties and their dubious practices, Richard Cook and the quaintly named Constitutional Research Council and the notorious Irvine Unionist Club, I'm thinking of you and your dark money donations, for example. Is it just the case in the UK that we're upset that the Russians are more direct about their manipulation of elections than we are?
Well, I suppose democracy is a kind of continuum rather than a singular noun, and clearly Russia is not really a democracy. I would guess that in New Zealand and Denmark, and I think within Scotland, the Scottish elections, based on the system we have, are getting close to being pretty good democracies. But there's a lot in between. I mean, Westminster's clearly not very democratic. I think there are problems in other parts of Europe as well, and we have seen attempts to actually distort the system here. I can remember in the past, the Labour Party in South Yorkshire harvesting votes from women from ethnic minorities who never left the house. So I I don't know. I mean, it's no surprise. I don't think any of us are surprised about what would happen in Russia. It was never going to be a real democracy.
Thanks, John. Actually, I was going to look at the events in the reported events in Russia a little bit through the prism of Scottish, what we take to be democracy in Scotland and our systems. As I said, the scale of the victory means that United Russia will have more than two-thirds of the deputies in the State Duma lower house of parliament, and that this will enable it to continue to push through laws without having to rely on other parties. Now, that's
Hmm.
obviously a very different system to the Scottish government, where we were given a voting system intended to prevent majorities and
Yeah,
intended to prevent Scottish governments being able to push through legislation. And we probably
yeah.
saw that towards the end of the last Parliament. Do you think that there might be political lessons or lessons for governments in what we're seeing in Russia and in Scotland at the moment?
Oh, I think there has been research into the Scottish and the Westminster systems, and I seem to remember seeing a conclusion that suggested, in terms of representing the voters, the outcomes of an election to Holyrood, the outcomes there are about four times more democratic, four times more representative of people voting and having a chance of being represented. It's not perfect. Clearly, there's an element of first past the post in Scotland too, but I think that. I mean, I don't know whether there are lessons to be gained from Russia, apart from don't. Just anything that happens in Russia, don't.
Thanks, John. We'll move to our next story now, and that is to return to COVID. That residents in care homes for older people are to be the first to be offered the coronavirus booster vaccinations from today. This group will be offered both flu and COVID-19 booster vaccines after the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation advised that they could be given alongside one another. From Tuesday, the 21st of September, frontline health and social care workers are able to book an appointment for a booster jab online at NHS Inform. The portal can be used by all health and social care workers to book a flu vaccine. Adults aged 70 years and over, and those 16 years and over and who are on the highest risk list, previously known as the shielding list, will begin to be contacted by letter or by their GP from the end of September. People on the highest risk list who were severely immunosuppressed at the time of their last vaccination will be offered a third primary dose instead. Other eligible groups, including all those aged 16 to 49 years with underlying health conditions, adult carers, unpaid and young carers, adult household contacts of immunosuppressed individuals, and all adults over 50 will be able to book an appointment online from October. Meanwhile, also from today, children and young people aged 12 to 15 years old can go to drop-in clinics for a vaccination if they wish to get their jab before they receive a letter inviting them for a scheduled appointment. Everyone in this age group will be invited for vaccination at a community-based clinic or a school delivery session from the 27th of September. So, John, first of all, we saw anti-vaccination protests in London, and I saw them in Edinburgh on Saturday. Uh, what do you think that the response to these boosters and these further announcements might be amongst the vaccine deniers?
Well, I think their presence is overstated. I mean, naturally, mainstream media seeks that kind of story. The history of vaccination in Scotland is of very high, very, very high uptake, and that includes even controversial vaccines such as the MMR. Scotland has the highest vaccine uptake and has done for decades. I don't see anything different here. And one of the really important stories not told by our mainstream media was the story of the vaccinations in the care homes in Scotland, which saved thousands of lives. Because right at the beginning, in December last year, the Scottish NHS found a way to get the Pfizer jag into all the care homes. They found a way to split the batches. NHS England decided not to do that, and they delayed the vaccination of care home staff, excuse me, and residents, and used some of those vaccinations just to try and boost the numbers with easy low-hanging fruit in an attempt to compete with Europe, I think. And in Scotland, we very quickly saw all the care home staff and all the residents, all of them vaccinated before anybody else. And I mean, I've written about this on my blog quite a lot. These figures are not used by anyone else pretty much, but you can see it quite clearly. The death rate in English care homes was many times higher per head of population than in Scottish homes. Excuse me.
One Thanks, John. One sincerely hopes that the analysis of that data and the analysis of that data sits front and centre as the public inquiries into the public response to the pandemic begins, because it is important that we get detailed and proper analysis, which is driven by the data, not by the politics.
So
One
that
other
was pushed
question I was
through.
going
That
to
was
ask.
pushed through. Sorry, just to say that was pushed through by June
Yeah.
Freeman, someone who was terribly demonised by the Scottish media, just as Hamza Yousaf is being demonised at the moment. They seem to have an obsession with health secretaries and trying to push them out. I mean, that was a great achievement, what was achieved in Scottish care homes, and the Scottish media should be ashamed of themselves for ignoring it.
That's a good point.
Sorry, you were.
I'm sure I saw, no, I'm sure I read this morning some research beginning into the comparative politicisation of health policy in Scotland and Wales and England, in order to compare the media treatment of the health secretaries and other health professionals, in particular during the pandemic, when it's been brought into very sharp relief.
That was me.
And well, there we go. That it's clearly it's getting through. The other question I was going to ask you quickly was, well, and you were talking about the high levels of vaccine uptake in Scotland generally, and I'm bound to say that anecdotally entirely, as I drove past the protest in Edinburgh on Saturday, the anti-vaccine protest in Edinburgh on Saturday afternoon, the person I was chauffeuring was insisting on stopping the car, jumping out of the car, and insisting on examining the BCG mark on the arm of everybody who was protesting against vaccines. I managed to suggest that he didn't do that. But do you think vaccine certificates from the 1st of October and the availability of vaccination for 12 to 15-year-olds will encourage the vaccine take-up amongst younger citizens in Scotland, perhaps in the same way that we think it has done in France?
Well, I think it seems likely. I mean, obviously, and I don't like to speak in advance of the research findings on anything at all, but there are some who believe that certification might encourage some not to have vaccines. I didn't quite understand the psychology of that. I would think we continue in the way we have done with a higher percentage vaccinated here than elsewhere in the UK.
Thank you, John. We'll move to another health story now, and that is that the Scottish Government has agreed with the Welsh Government, the Northern Ireland Executive, and the Westminster Government to take forward the fortification of flour with folic acid. Following consultation with industry, stakeholders, and the public, folic acid will be added to flour across the UK in order to reduce the risk of around 200 neural tube defects in fetuses, which can happen in early stages of pregnancies. Women trying to become pregnant are recommended to take folic acid supplements to increase folate levels. But with over 50% of the pregnancies in the UK unplanned, and women may not know they should take folic acid supplements until a pregnancy is confirmed, so this action is being taken to increase folic acid intake generally. Wholemeal flour and gluten-free foods are not subject to mandatory fortification, and these products are not in the initial scope of this policy. Responding to the announcement, the Public Health Minister, Marie Todd, said, "The Scottish Government has long advocated for the mandatory fortification of flour with folic acid to reduce the risk of neural tube defects in fetuses. I am pleased to confirm today that the Scottish Government will proceed with a Four Nations approach to introduce mandatory fortification of flour." So, John, I'm reminded that at a UK government level in 2000, a UK advisory committee recommended mandatory folic acid fortification. In 2002, the board of the UK's Food Standards Agency decided against such an action. The Food Standards Agency's Scientific Advisory Committee, which had replaced the Committee on Medical Aspects, published a report in 2006, and then there was a further Food Standards Agency consultation. And then following the consultation in May 2007, the board recommended mandatory fortification of bread and flour with folic acid. And here we are now today in 2021 being told that the policy is being taken forward. Why do you think that there is this, what I can only describe as yes minister style kicking of this can of folic acid down the road? Do you think it is just that the science has been too unclear, or are there other interests in play, or is it just the inability or unwillingness of the Westminster Civil Service to do very much?
I think there's a fear amongst researchers and medics. There's a fear of jumping too quickly just in case something goes wrong. You know, they think of thalidomide or whatever else it is, and they think that. So there's an inbuilt kind of caution. But it's quite remarkable if you look at, just as a contrast, if you look at the packaging of any processed food and just see what's in it, you find that the average package of processed food will have about 40 different ingredients, emulsifiers and preservatives and so on. And yet when we try to introduce something that's clearly designed to help people, it has to go through all the hoops, takes 20 years, and then maybe makes out the other end. So it's quite surprising in some ways, but I think it's an inbuilt kind of conservatism amongst professionals, researchers. They fear making mistakes.
One can understand why. And having spoken about vaccine deniers a moment ago, I'm not going to ask you whether we'll now see anti-folic acid campaigns from Jeremy Corbyn's brother and the actor Lawrence Fox. And instead, we'll move on to our final story this evening, which is that this Organ and Tissue Donation Week marks the 6 months since Scotland moved to an opt-out system of organ and tissue donation. New figures show over half of people, 54% in Scotland, have now registered their donation decision, 51.5% to be a donor, and 2.8% choosing to opt out. This opt-out system was introduced on 26th of March this year to save and improve lives. If people aged 16 and over haven't opted out of donation, they will be considered a possible donor if they die in circumstances in which they could donate. Under the opt-out system, everyone has a choice to be a donor or opt out of donation, but it's important to make that decision known. In Scotland, there are an average of around 500 people currently waiting on organ transplant. However, only around 1% of the people die in a way that makes organ donation possible. So, John, if 54% of the Scottish population has registered its choice on the organ donation register in 6 months, does that suggest to you that the message is getting through?
It does. It does. I mean, personally, I don't see any problem in this. I don't personally understand why you would be concerned about someone's internal organs after they've gone. I mean, I think maybe I'm being harsh here, but as far as I'm concerned, we're food for the worms. So I don't see any problem. If anyone wants my organs after the amount of Guinness I've had, then they're welcome to them.
I hear you, John. I was also going to ask you in political terms, how do you think this relative success plays with the right wing and Tory politicians who usually instinctively want to monetize organs or blood, as happens in the US, but who now see their fellow citizens offering to give these things away for free to people in desperate
Yes,
need for them? How do you
must
think
be
this will play
shocking.
in the right wing?
Well, not very well, I wouldn't have thought, as you've said. We've seen what happens on the extreme right wing in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, where lots of money was made from taking organs that weren't actually used up.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, John. And that is the way things are at Scotland at 7 this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we would like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and leave us a message there. Meantime, we will be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. I'd like to say thank you to Professor John Robertson for joining us this evening. John, it's been fantastic speaking to you. Thank you for everything this evening.
Pleasure.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. And so that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.